Hey everybody, Chris with Overclockersclub. We're going to have some fun today. We're going to do a complete system build, except we're going to do it a little differently. We're going to start off with the build, in this case, the Corsair Spec-Omega RGB, and then we're going to go ahead and build the same system in the 465X RGB from Corsair. And then we're going to let you pick which one you like best. So special thanks to Corsair for sponsoring this build. Let's get started. Alright, going over the components here, we'll start off with the Corsair HX850 fully modular power supply. And then also from Corsair, our RAM will be the Vengeance Pro RGB, 3200 megahertz and 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM. And to spice things up a little in the RGB department, I'm going to throw this QL120 triple fan kit into these cases. Storage here, also from Corsair, is the MP600, and we're going to take advantage of this Gen 4 PCIe Gen 4 capability on this MSI MPG X570 Gaming Edge Wi-Fi motherboard. And on that motherboard we will install the Ryzen 7 3800X, the brand new CPU from AMD. To cool that CPU, we'll use the H100i Pro from Corsair. And then for graphics card from MSI, we'll be using the 2070 Super Geforce Rtx. Alright, so before I really tear into it, I want to go over something here. The manual is probably the most important piece of documentation you've got. And by manual, I mean the manual for the motherboard. No matter how many systems you've built, no matter how much experience you've got, it's still a really good idea to go through the manual, familiarize yourself with all the setup instructions, and save yourself some headaches later on. Starting with the motherboard, which is from MSI. This is the MPG X570 Wi-Fi motherboard. And I picked this for a couple of reasons. The first reason is it has the X570 chipset, which supports the latest Gen 4 PCIe specification. And I wanted to do that because I was planning on getting the latest solid-state drive that also supports the speeds that go along with the PCIe Gen 4. The other reason I picked it, and this is about a $200 motherboard right now. Isaiah at OCC, one of our reviewers, has already reviewed this motherboard, so you can check that out on the OCC website. But this became available when he was done with it, so I said, why not run with that? Alright, so looking at the motherboard in a little more detail. So here's the MP600 solid state drive, and you can see it has its own heat sink because these get rather warm. And the motherboard is equipped with this plate here you have to take off because the slot for the solid state drive is right under here. So you take these two screws out, and they're taking advantage of the chipset cooling fan to blow air and keep this plate cool to help pull a little more heat away from the solid state drive, which again, like I said, has its own heat sink on there. But that goes in here very carefully, about a 30-degree angle, and then drop it down. Now there's already a screw here on this motherboard, but it's a special little screw that you use to secure the drive. Right there. Tiny little screw, very easy to lose, so be careful with that. But that's what sort of locks the solid state drive in position so that it doesn't move around. And you just snug that down a little bit. It doesn't need to be horribly tight. And then this heatsink here has its own little pad with the protective sticker, so we pull that off. And then we place that back on there, and what that'll do, that'll make contact with the top of the heatsink and further aid in heat transfer. So as you could see, the integrated heatsink for the motherboard will not fit with the tall heatsink that's included on the drive. And my gut feel is that I'm going to trust this heatsink that came with the drive in terms of its thermal purposes over trying to make this one fit. So I'm just going to leave this one off, and we should be just fine. And something to point out, now every motherboard will be a little different as far as where they put their M.2 slots and the number that are on the motherboard, but on this particular motherboard we have 2 of the slots for your M.2 solid state drives. And this slot only supports PCIe 3.0 on this motherboard, and this slot supports both the older 3.0 and the current 4.0. So if you have an older solid state drive that only supports 3.0, then you can use it in either position and it won't matter. If you have a newer drive that is the PCIe 4.0, then you only want to put it here in this position if you want to take advantage of the full speed. And there's the CPU box opened up. There's the CPU, the Ryzen 7 3800X, and this comes with a very nice and rather capable Wraith cooler, and I will probably go ahead and use it just for setup and testing, but ultimately I'll use the Corsair H100i cooler. And there is the CPU, and there are tiny little pins, and you want to be very careful not to bend the pins. And there's a little triangle in one of the corners here. Actually, it's this corner right here, and you match that up with a little triangle on the socket, which is the upper right hand corner. So it is keyed if you've never put one of these in before. So you pick it up very carefully. You find the little triangle, make sure this lever is pulled back, and then you very carefully place that in there, and it should just sort of drop right in, which it did. And make sure it's seated, and then you pull the lever, and we're ready for the cooler, which, again, for testing purposes, we'll start with this cooler, but it has the thermal paste already applied. And AMD does a pretty good job of simplifying the mounting. So there's a clip on one side. You get attached, and then you get the other side clipped on there, and there's a little lever that you pull, and it locks down the cooler with the right amount of pressure. And then of course there's the connector for the fan. And next we'll go with the RAM, and again I'm using the Vengeance RGB Pro, 3200 megahertz, 2 sticks of 16 gigabytes each. And if you want to know the actual, let's see, part number, I'm not going to try and read that off. That's what I'm using right there. And it is important to know which slots to use. So the manual says, since I'm using 2 sticks, I want to use B2 and A2. So it'll be the first one from the edge of the motherboard, skip one, and then the next one in. And the slot in the middle here is offset a little, so you want to make sure you have that timed right. All right. I'm going to be powering it up soon, so I'm going to mount it to this little workbench motherboard tray I made. So that just took a couple minutes to get this mounted to that little aluminum motherboard tray. I used 1-inch standoffs there, but it's a lot easier to do setup and testing and debug when it's not in a case. And we are using the HX850, which is an 850 watt power supply. I've got it hooked up, and there's really not too much to hook up. There's your 24 pin main connector, and then over here for the CPU power we've got a 8 pin and an additional 4 pin connector for this CPU. And the next step really is attach the graphics card and the power cables for it, and we'll be ready to power it up. And now we're ready for this bad boy from MSI. This is the Geforce Rtx 2070 Super, and you can check out the review for this on the Overclockersclub website that Isaiah has done. So now this gets attached into the first slot. Just like that. And then I've got to attach some power. And it looks like no, I can do all this with one cable. This has a 6 and an 8 on the end there. So now I'll do a quick walk around to make sure everything's plugged in. Now I don't have Windows, of course, on the hard drive yet, so I'll have to just get into the BIOS for now, but I like to make sure RAM modules are seated, everything's plugged in, because there's some rookie mistakes you can make when you get in a hurry. And there was one thing I forgot. This motherboard does not have a power or reset button, so you can manually start it. So I had to grab an old I/O piece of hardware there and attach the connectors. So now we can fire it up. And there it goes. So my HDMI to DisplayPort adapter wasn't working, so I had to go grab a dedicated DisplayPort cable. But as soon as I did, screen came up. I got into the BIOS and pointed to my USB drive there that has a Windows installer on it. And within about 2 minutes I was off to the races there getting Windows installed. And then I just throw a secondary fan here off to the side just to get a little air circulating. Windows finished installing in just a few minutes, and then I'll go through the BIOS, see if it needs updated, make any other BIOS tweaks, and then check all of the device drivers to make sure they're all current and updated. So I got into the BIOS and played around with it for a little bit, and made some adjustments and checked the performance, and I think I found a sweet spot for just good daily usage, where I'm able to run an overclock here slightly with 4 gigahertz, and I'm holding the CPU temperature right now at around 85°C. The voltage is around 1.26, 1.28. I've seen it jump around. Fan is running around 3000 RPMs, and I'm using Prime 95 to put the load on the CPU. And this is just to sort of see how this little included Wraith CPU cooler performs. Kind of gives me a line in the sand. And I'll run the same test with the same settings on the H100i just to sort of see what the difference is. And this is the H100i Pro. It's an RGB cooler. Now I've already sort of had this thing installed in the 275R airflow. So I pulled it out of that case, and I'm going to go ahead and install it here on this AMD CPU and run the same thermal test there just to sort of see what the numbers look like with this one. So I'll have to swap the bracket to this AMD mount. It comes from the factory with the Intel bracket already installed, but it just twists a little and then pops off. And then I'll have to get the little side clips on there. And again, it comes with this Intel bracket already installed, but it comes off very easily. There are 4 little lugs and key slots in the bracket, and you just give it a slight twist and it pops off. And then the AMD bracket, it has these ears that stick up, and you actually want them to face away from the base plate, so they'll go on there like this. You line the lugs up and then give it a twist and it pops right on. And I got a fresh application of thermal paste on the pump. This is the H100i Pro RGB. Of course, there's the RGB part. The fans on this particular cooler are not RGB. And I have the same settings. So same overclock, very mild overclock, and our temperature there is around 70, 71, which is quite a bit lower than what we saw before with the stock cooler. I believe it was around 84, 85. There's the fan RPMs and the pump RPMs. And that thermal number there is not really a surprise when you've got a nice all-in-one liquid cooler compared to a stock air cooler. But the stock air cooler is certainly adequate for most uses, but if you want to kick it up a notch, the H100i Pro is the way to go. And this is the 465X RGB case from Corsair. First case I'll do the assembly in, and the front is off so that I can get to the fans, because I wanted to put the radiator. Initially I thought about the top, but the RAM here is a little bit tall. Corsair does make lower profile RAM, but this particular RAM is just a little too tall, and the radiator hits when you mount it at the top. So I decided to just mount it in the front in a push-pull configuration, so the factory stock case fans are still mounted in the front with the radiator right behind it, and then the fans that come with the H100i Pro will be in the back. So it'll be a push-pull configuration. But what I had to do is take the little screws out that hold these top two fans in and replace them with these longer screws that come with the cooler. So these screws go in and go through the fan and secure the radiator in the proper position. So it's slowly coming together, doing some cable management. I took this hard drive cage out of the bottom to make a little more room, and I'm getting ready to put the power supply in. This particular chassis, the 465X RGB, is very, very similar. In fact, it's almost identical to the 275R Airflow. And when I went to remove this hard drive cage on the 275R Airflow, I already had the power supply in and I couldn't get this out. So if you're going to remove this, you need to do it before you put your power supply in. And another quick look at the inside of the case. I've got the cable routing pretty much wrapped up. One thing I wanted to point out, a little tip, is in the upper left hand corner there are two cables coming in to power the CPU, the connectors on the motherboard. This one has an 8-pin and a 4-pin. Some motherboards just have one connector there. Anyway, depending upon the case you're using, space up there can be really tight, and it is in this particular case. So you want to make sure you get those cables plugged in before you mount your cooler if you're using a large air cooler. And if you're using a all-in-one liquid cooler, then it doesn't really matter because you have tons of room. But again, if you're using an air cooler with a large heat sink, you want to make sure you don't forget those cables and get them plugged in. Now, looking at the graphics card, this is the MSI 2070 Super that I'll be using, and it doesn't look that big until you compare it to my old faithful GTX 770, which is quite ancient by today's standards. But I planned on using this vertical GPU mount here on the side, which this case supports a vertical GPU because I had this particular one in there and it fits fine, and there's about a 1/2 inch clearance between the intake of the fan and the inside of the glass, so there was plenty of room to get air. However, this card here is much thicker, and those fans are pretty much up against the glass when I had it installed. And the problem with that is you could restrict some airflow there. So an older style graphics card or a smaller graphics card, you can probably go with the vertical mount with no issues. But this one I'm going to have to mount right here in the PCIe slot on the motherboard in the regular horizontal position. Got the front back on the case. So really the last thing to do here is to install this QL120 fan kit. Just sort of spice up the interior with some RGB lighting effects, and then we can power it up. Now I'm getting the QL120 fan kit in there. I've got the exhaust fan in, and I'll put the other two fans in the top. And I realized I ran out of headers on the motherboard to plug the fan connector into here. So I just happen to have one of these splitters here, or a box of these splitters from Noctua. And it is the NA-SYC1 Chromax in black. Now they make these in a lot of different colors, but this one here should allow me to connect two fans to one header. So there is the 465X with the system build in it. And before I put the side glass on there, I'll get a quick shot of the interior, because with the side glass there's a lot of reflection, so it's hard to really see what's going on sometimes inside the case. Now with the lights out, you can really see the RGB effects come to life. And with the glass side panel on, you don't get the reflections when the lights are out. But that's a nice looking system. Now, some of you may point out that the overclock was really pretty mild, and I did that for a reason. The stock cooler, of course, is not really designed for hard overclocking, and it would be pretty easy to pick an overclock that would completely bury this, just absolutely wipe it out thermally. And that's not my point, because once this goes up to the thermal limit, you're not really proving anything. So I could have picked 4.1, 4.2, but 4.0 really showed a nice sweet spot, I think, that showed a nice difference between the two, so you get an idea of the performance of an aftermarket cooler compared to a stock cooler. The second thing, early in the video, I believe I stated that I was going to start with this case here. This is the Spec-Omega RGB, and I didn't. I actually got started with the 465X RGB. So it really doesn't matter, but I'm going to go ahead now and transfer the guts from this case to this one. And then you can post in the comments below which system build or which case you like better. The 465X RGB or the Spec-Omega RGB. Everything is pretty much disconnected, and I'm about ready to get the motherboard out of the case, so I'll lay it down flat to make that a little easier, and then we'll get things rolling with the Spec-Omega RGB. But I need to plan exactly where I'm going to put some of these things, such as the H100i radiator and these three QL120 fans that I want to add to this case. But I have to figure out exactly where that'll all fit with the included HD120 RGB fans that come already installed in the Spec-Omega. So I think what I'll do is take that fan out of the rear exhaust and put the radiator actually down here so it'll fill the bottom part of the case. And then I'll put the two HD120 fans in front so that you can see them through the front glass section, so we can show those fans off there. Then I'll take the three QL120s and put one here in the top, two, and then three to sort of maximize the RGB effect. The other thing to figure out is this power supply shroud. If I want to use it or not, I'm kind of on the fence. Sometimes it really looks nice and clean, but sometimes you want to show off your power supply. The good thing is this is easily removable, so I guess I can kind of show it both ways and see which one looks best. The motherboard is semi-installed. I still have to put some screws in there, but I got a couple just to hold it in position for now. And the radiator, I think it's going to work out quite well in the lower position. And I moved this HD120 fan from the rear exhaust position to the top above this fan. This is the one that was already included in this position. And then I had to change the screws. I'm in the process of doing that, but the screws that held the fan in are these small with a coarse thread, and I'm using the ones that come with the H100i cooler because I have to go through the fan here and into the radiator to secure it. All the screws are now installed, so the fans and the radiator are secured. This will be the same sort of push-pull configuration that I had on the last case. So we got the front fans that are pushing the air into the radiator, and then the back fans, these are the fans that come with the H100i Pro. They'll be pulling the air out and exhausting it into the case. I talked about putting these in the front, actually mounting them to the front, but the more I looked at it, I think they're fine staying right there in that plane, so they're sort of behind the front plane of the chassis. So next is the power supply, and there's the spaghetti monster of cables coming from the power supply. Now this is a fully modular power supply, so you only have to plug in the cables that you're using, but I've always kind of liked to see the fan on my power supply. It's good to check to see if it's running. However, a lot of newer power supplies and this HX850 have a 0 RPM fan when it's not needed, so it will actually be idle and you won't be able to tell if your power supply fan is running necessarily if there's not enough heat to cause it to turn on. Now the advantages and disadvantages, you could argue, well, you're pulling case air in, it may be warm. I don't know that your case air is warm enough to really cause a problem. So if that does bother you, then you can flip this over so that the fan is facing down and you'll be pulling air in from the bottom of the case and it'll get filtered through this bottom filter panel. You do have to worry about dropping screws or anything in here. That would not be good. So maybe I will go ahead and flip that over. And the other reason that kind of makes me want to flip that over is if I go ahead and use the Shroud, and again, some people like them, some people not so much. But anyway, if you put the Shroud in, it's going to pretty much choke off the air inlet for that fan. So unless you have a Shroud that is vented, you may not want to do that. So now that I look at it, if I want to use that Shroud, I think I'm going to go ahead and flip that power supply over. There, so I got the power supply flipped over, and in the process, somehow I managed to put a pretty nice scratch in there, but that's nothing that a good old Sharpie there can't kind of halfway remedy. Much better. The power supply shroud for this case, and I like it, it's removable, and it is in two pieces, so you get sort of like a front section and a back section. The goal here was to sort of hide some of the cables, although with the radiator there in the lower position, I can't really put this front half of the shroud in there, so I'm going to have some cable clutter there that might be a little hard to really hide. So we'll see how that looks and how well the fans are visible, because this front section here is sort of tapered, so the closer the fans are to the bottom, the more you're going to see of them. But I might shift that whole radiator and the fans up to the upper position. I'll just kind of see what it looks like when I power it up and make a decision at that point. Well, sometimes you have to change your plans on the fly, and I went to put the graphics card in, and it is so long that between here and here it just barely would fit. In fact, it actually was pushing on the fans, and I just really didn't want to do that. So I know initially I planned on putting these fans on the outside of the chassis face here, and then I decided, no, let's just leave them on the inside. But it looks like I'm going to have to push them on the outside of the chassis face if I want to put the radiator in front like that, so I have enough clearance for the graphics card. So sometimes your plans change. Well, that was just a quick detour, but I have the fans relocated to the front. Took actually longer to fish all the cables back through everywhere than it did to actually move the fans. Now I could have just taken the two back fans off, and if I wasn't putting the QL120 fans, these other two fans here, in the top of the case, I would have had room. I probably just would have moved these two fans there and just run the system with the two front fans. But since I don't have anywhere else to really put those fans, I'll just leave them there. Now this case is all powered up. I haven't really fooled with the lighting profiles just yet, but those are the three QL120 fans that I added to the case. They come separate. They're not included with this particular case. And then the two RGB fans, the HD120s that are included. The top one there was actually the exhaust fan. I moved it to the front, and it doesn't look too bad, even though it's partially obscured. And I'll get that rat's nest of wiring tucked away and get the case kind of buttoned up, dim the lights, get the lighting profiles adjusted, and see what it looks like. And here is the Spec-Omega RGB. I've got the visor lighting effect mode on currently. And there's a good look at the inside of the case. And then coming around the back, and then looking at the top, you can see the RGB fans, the QL120s there, through the top of the case. And this shows up a little better. This is the rainbow wave mode. You don't have to wait for the visor part to sort of cycle through. The LED effects are just sort of on all the time. It's easier to see the case fans at the top. And here is the Corsair Spec-Omega RGB with the lights on. I changed the color mode there to rainbow wave. I think that really shows off the RGB effects the best. So thanks for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. And a special thanks to Corsair for providing the bulk of the hardware for this system build. There are the three QL120 fans. So this really does show, though, this is really an experience of patience and taking your time, because there will always be little roadblocks, little speed bumps in your build, things that you don't anticipate, no matter how many systems you've built. And the key is to just be patient and take your time. So post some comments, tell me what you like, tell me which case you like, tell me about your current system builds. So this is Chris with Overclockersclub, and thanks for watching.